He came suddenly at this moment, as he stumbled along the river bank under the moonless and cloudless sky, upon yet another of these chance-sent mediums of unaccountable feeling. This was an aged post with an iron ring attached to it, used formerly for the purpose of mooring the small barges that in the old days brought corn up the Brew. This post was but an obscure landmark by the flow of that dark tide, but Sam knew its exact position, and he knew every detail of the landscape from this particular spot. He couldn't really see the iron ring upon the post, but he knew so well that it was there that he saw it without seeing it. But for some reason, the mere sight of this post filled him with the most releasing, liberating, and exultant of all his recent transports. His mind was so occupied with the idea of pain that he quite consciously began opposing this thrilling sensation with the opacity of pain. It was as if he took up great spadefuls of pain, and flung them into the pathway of the delicious current that flowed through him. And in proportion as the current increased, so he threw more spadefuls of pain in front of it. But it swept them away as it flowed on, drank them up, swallowed them all into itself. And yet it would not be true to say that they became identical with the rushing flood of this ecstatic feeling. They were not absorbed as a natural sustenance. They nourished this flood, but the flood existed independently of them and did not depend upon them for its origin or its issue. Don't know what he's talking about right now. Sam found himself on his knees by this old post. So thrilled was he by the transport that poured through him, and in his exultation he pressed his forehead against it and ran his fingers up and down its damp sides. And he did again begin, quite desperately now, to solve the mystery of all these experiences. He began to realize that the soul of the inanimate, the indwelling breath of life in all these ancient lifeless things, whereof the town was so full, was really moving towards him. Oh, okay, I think I remember now what was going on. The emotion he experienced now was a good deal stronger than what he had been produced in him until tonight by stones and gates and paving slabs and patches of moss and fragments of old walls and carved moldings and dead tree stumps and plowed up furrows and wayside puddles and gutters. But it was the same kind of mood. Something in the atomic nature of the inorganic substance of these things must have answered to an inarticulate craving of Sam's, until matter itself, the old obstinate protean mystery, moved and stirred to meet him. He could actually feel a magnetic power pouring forth into the fingers from this post against which he leaned. Sam had been born in Glastonbury. Glastonbury sights and sounds and smells, the psychic eidola that radiates forth from the surface of ancient inanimate substances, had surrounded him from his birth. Having concentrated his sluggish, earthy nature so steadily and so long upon birds and beasts and fishes, he must have accumulated an enormous mass of casually imprinted memories concerning his contact with the inorganic surroundings of these living creatures. By day and by night he must have touched, going up and down the fields, lanes, hillsides, valleys, fenlands, towpaths, spinneys, rhines, innumerable gates, weirs, walls, marsh tussocks, molehills, pond rails, heaps of stones, fallen trees, moss-grown ruins, and all these touches and casual contacts must have established between his inmost being and the mystery of matter in these things deep correspondences which were ready to rush forth at any summons. That was a pretty good reading of that, I'm going to say. Where lay the difference between the curious feeling he got as his fingers ran up and down the surface of this old barge post and other recent sensations of the same nature? The difference was that the feeling he had now associated itself subtly and strangely with that little dead fish that his father had taken out of the aquarium. The secret of matter had suddenly assumed a definite shape, and this shape was of a living kind, no longer inanimate, but electric with animation. Ichthys, the world fish. Where had he picked up this singular expression? Not from any book he could think of in his father's shelves, nor from the sermons of Mr. Simeon. That the mystery of matter, which had of late shivered through him in so many accidental contacts, should resolve itself in its primal leap, in its slippery quiver, in its uprising from the pools of silence into the actual form of a fish, would have been an insane fancy for anyone else, but for Sam, with his upbringing and environment, it bore an organic naturalness. Did he actually see in his mind's eye, then, the red fins, the greenish markings, the black stripes, the silvery tail of any real fish? No. It was more subtle than this. But he did feel as if the solid matter all round him had become porous, so that some essence of life could move swiftly through it. In the mute balancing of this finny-like essence, passing through the primeval watery element that existed in all things, lay the inexplicable clue. As he knelt in the damp mud of the towpath beside the post, while the darkness deepened over him and the river flowed beneath him, he was driven forward once more by the honesty of his soul to face the ultimate dilemma. He became vividly conscious of himself as one entity among all the rest, carried along upon the night journey of the voyaging planet, and he seemed able to catch upon the breathing wind, mingled with the gurglings and suckings of the water, the cries of pain which at that second, all over the world, were rising up. There must be a limit to pity, or the life stream would stop. All would grow stagnant, and Ichthys the worldfish would float dead upon its back. The first motive of every living creature must be to realize its own identity, to fight for itself against the cruelty of life, while the second motive of all conscious souls turned about towards the others. 1-2. 1-2. Went the heartbeat of the world. Was there a third pulse there that no one could yet hear? Why was it that Sam suddenly leapt up in great excitement to his feet? His fingers had encountered in the darkness at the foot of the post an iron chain. This chain was not fastened to the ring, else he would have detected it before. It was fastened round the bottom of the post so that it lay hidden in the grass. Sam crawled forward on his hands and knees, following the course of the chain, and he soon became aware of something floating on the water to which it was attached. From what he could discern, down there in the dark flow, it was a small black coal barge. This accounted for the constant gurglings and suckings that he had been aware of for some time, and by which his ear, trained to the river sound as it was, had been obscurely fretted. Hastily he rose to his feet and, scrambling down to the back, stepped into the barge. Yes, it still had some coal in it, and Sam could detect from the sharp turpentine smell that it had been newly tarred. There was a half-empty coal sack at one end, and groping with his fingers, he turned this over on its side and sat down upon it, with his back against the barge's stern. The tarry smell was overpowered as he rested here by the smell of the river, and soon the flapping up of some biggish bird. It wasn't a moorhen, he knew that, but it wasn't large enough to be a heron. Gave him a desire to think out in his mind exactly what his geographical position was, for this would be a help to establishing the identity of that bird. It was a habit natural to Sam and strengthened by long association with his father to take his bearings, as he called it. But at this juncture it did not seem as easy as usual to grasp the lay of the land as he sat in this barge. But he got it at last to his satisfaction. He was about a half a mile northeast of Cradle Bridge Farm and about a half a mile southwest of Cold Harbor Bridge, where young Toosey had showed him that fish. If that bird, which may have been a stray wild duck, had flowed due west from where he sat, it would have passed over the roofs of the villages of Catcut and Chilton upon Polden, and hit the swampy estuaries of the Parrot, somewhere about the center of Horsey Level, where the great Sedgemoor drain flows into them. All these places lay behind him as he sat in that barge on the Brew, for his face was turned directly towards the three eminences of the Isle of Glastonbury, Whirl Hill, Chalice Hill, and the Tor. Thus rested Sam Decker, and then, without a second's warning, the earth and the water and the darkness cracked. Whence it came, whether it came of its own volition, and whether it was the same transformation of matter which had been affecting him so of late, carried 1 degree further, Sam never knew. But he knew what was happening to him, and he knew it without the least doubt or question. What he saw was at first accompanied by a crashing pain. That was the word Sam himself thought of to express it. The word crashing. But as the vision clarified before him and grew distinct, this pain died away. But it was dazzling, hurting, blinding at first, and it was associated in his mind with the sense of a sharp, long, sharp thing piercing his guts. His sensation was indeed strangely definite. The pain was so overwhelming that it was as if the whole of Sam's consciousness became the hidden darkness of his inmost organism. And when this darkness was split, what he felt to be a gigantic spear was stuck into his bowels and struck from below. He had ceased to be a man sitting on a coal sack at the stern of a barge. He had become a bleeding mass of darkness. His consciousness was a dark surface of water, and up through this water, tearing it, rending it, dividing it, turning it into blood, shivered this crashing stroke, the stroke that was delivered from abysses of the earth, far deeper than the bottom of the Brew. Whatever the spear was that struck him, to his whole animal nature quivering under it, it was as much this shock of something totally unknown, something now new to human experience, outrageous in its strangeness, that tore so at his vitals, as the crashing pain that it brought with it. But when the vision appeared, and it came sailing into the midst of this bleeding darkness that was Sam's consciousness, healing everything, changing everything, each detail of what he saw with a clearness that branded it forever upon his brain. He saw a globular chalice that had 2 circular handles. The substance of it was made of was clearer than crystal, and within it there was a dark watery streaked with blood, and within the water was a shining fish. Sam's first thought was, "This is the GRAIL! This is the GRAIL! It has come back to Glastonbury!" His second thought was, "I must tell Father and Nell about this." His third thought was more realistic, and it was one so congruous with his deepest being that the mere fact that he had had it, when he remembered the whole thing, put the seal of authenticity upon his vision. He thought in his heart, "What is that fish? It is a tench. Surely it is a tench." So anxious did he become to ascertain before it vanished away, that this ichthus out of the absolute was what he thought it was, that Sam actually struggled up to his feet and cried the question out loud. Christ! He groaned in a harsh, queer voice that resembled the voice of a priest speaking from a scaffold. Is it a tench? Well, we'll leave it at that. Wondering what kind of fish is in the GRAIL. Getting pretty good now. I'm liking it. And until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.